Okay, welcome to this session on the vaccination as a potential tool for control of avian influenza. This session has experienced a couple of small setbacks. My co-chair, Katie Adam, is at home sick with COVID, but nevertheless has been beavering away furiously behind the scenes, preparing slides and making contacts. It turns out that this conference also coincides with the launch of vaccination against avian influenza in France. The slight downside of that, which means that our external speaker from France, who was supposed to send a pre-recorded talk, has been unable to do so. Presumably he's frantically engaged in actually vaccinating against avian influenza. So Harriet Auty has extremely kindly been up since the middle of the night, preparing slides in order to step in place of Jean-Luc Guérin. So if I can welcome Harriet Auty to the floor to kick off our session.
Yeah, thank you. This wasn't a talk I anticipated giving today, but Katie and I have pulled some slides together because we thought, I mean, it's disappointing because I think we were all looking forward to hearing more about the vaccination campaigns in France and kind of the reasons for instigating that. But I thought it was still useful to provide an overview of sort of what's been happening and where that's up to provide some context for the rest of the session. So please bear with me. I know a lot more about vaccination of ducks in France than I did a couple of hours ago, but I know there's people in this room who probably know more about this than me. So let's have this as a starting point, and then please, other people who have been involved in the discussions about this, please do contribute later so that we're not just depending on mine and Katie's last minute presentation. So the background to this is that France really suffered from enormous outbreaks of HPAI over the last couple of years, and really significant impacts, particularly in the duck sector. So over 22 million poultry culled in the 2021 and 22 season. So really significant impacts, really a lot of pressure on that sector, and to the point where there's been concerns about things like the genetic stock remaining in France for some of the sectors. And that's led, as I understand it, to a lot of pressure from the farming industry, from farmers, particularly from the duck sector, to be able to put in place additional control measures, and particularly vaccination. And vaccination has been used in other parts of the world, for example, in Asia, but it hasn't been used in Europe. The challenge is that it makes it difficult to know whether exported poultry are virus-free. So it's the concerns really about trade and the impacts on trade. So there haven't been any licensed vaccines in Europe. But this landscape is now changing, both in terms of, I think, attitudes and in terms of the legislation behind it. So earlier this year, well, over the last year and a half, really, organisations in France have been starting to put together kind of the pieces they need to implement a vaccination campaign. So they've conducted vaccine trials, they identified 2 candidate vaccines, carried out vaccine trials on those 2 vaccines, and then have looked at strategies for how they'd be implemented. And as Louise mentioned, that vaccine period started on the 1st of October, so I think in reality vaccination started yesterday, so I can see why people in France might be quite busy. And earlier this year as well, the European Union approved sort of encouragement to use vaccination alongside other tools for HPAI. And at the WOA meeting in May, this was also a big topic of discussion in terms of how to implement sort of additional controls, and vaccination was one of the main tools that was being considered, as well as more implementation of compartmentalisation and zoning. And the conclusion from that, the regulation states that there would not be other consequences for trade if the WOA standards are followed on vaccination. So France has put in place these 2 vaccine trials. They had 2 candidate vaccines, one made by Boehringer and one by Siva. And these trials were conducted by a sort of a collaboration of various organisations, so ANSYS, the Toulouse National Veterinary School, the Trade Union for Foie Gras producers, some of the regional councils where that production is focused, and the 2 vaccine manufacturers. And the aims of these vaccination trials were to confirm that the vaccine would be well tolerated, to induce immunity that would allow differentiation between infected and vaccinated animals, so to meet the DIVA requirements, to help reduce the excretion of virus by vaccinated birds, and to see if it would limit the transmission of virus to other vaccinated ducks. So the trial was conducted in 2 parts. This was on ducks. So first on farm trials, where groups of ducks were vaccinated alongside unvaccinated controls, and then sampled every 2 weeks to look at both immune response and virus shedding. And overall, the results of that part of the study were successful. The vaccine was well tolerated. Immunity was induced and could be detected by ELISA. There was a reduction in virus excretion and a shorter virus excretion period. The second part of the trial was to take some of those birds that had been vaccinated to viral challenge studies. And again, this part of the trial was deemed to be successful. There was very limited direct transmission, with the R0 really very low compared to the non-vaccinated groups, and no airborne transmission between the vaccinated for both the 2 vaccine groups. I should say I'm not aware of publications that have come out that describe all the details of these trials, but there are reports online that describe these outcomes. So it seems that overall the 2 candidate vaccines gave quite similar results, but ultimately the Boehringer vaccine was chosen to go forward to the implementation, and 80 million doses of the vaccine were ordered. One of the issues in terms of the logistics of the use of this vaccine is it does require 2 doses, and they have to be administered subcutaneously, so they have to be injected. So that does put some logistical requirements on how vaccination can be implemented. In terms of the strategy, I guess overall the objectives that they stated for a vaccination campaign was to anticipate outbreaks so that they could prevent spread of AI from infected farms, and to protect the poultry sector, particularly regarding preserving the gene pool, and so that they could get back to production faster afterwards. And I guess there was a decision to be taken between emergency and preventive vaccination. They decided against emergency vaccination, it seems, for 2 reasons. Firstly, that it takes estimated 3 to 4 weeks for immunity to be acquired. So using vaccination in an emergency situation, there would be a long lag period before you got immunity in place, which wouldn't really be appropriate in the face of an active outbreak. And secondly, there was concerns that having people go on farm to conduct vaccination, particularly with the 2 doses needed in that scenario, would be high risk from a biosecurity point of view. So the decision was taken to go with a preventive strategy. So from 2 days ago, vaccination is now mandatory for all commercial farms keeping more than 250 ducks who are producing food products, so meat or foie gras intended for food production. So it's specifically targeted at ducks. That covers about 64 million ducks over 2,700 farms. It covers the whole of France, and at the moment it's for a period of 1 year starting from the 1st of October. In addition, there are some options for voluntary vaccination, so farms that have breeding ducks producing hatching eggs or day-old ducklings for the domestic market can do optional vaccination if they choose to, but they can't, if they're producing either of those for export, then they're not allowed to vaccinate to avoid disruption of export trade in those products. And overall, this vaccination campaign is estimated to cost around 100 million euros, of which 85% will be covered by the state and the remainder by the sectors. There will be continuing surveillance after the vaccination, so enhanced passive surveillance and then active surveillance of these vaccinated flocks to look at, transmission risks after vaccination. And in terms of outbreak control, if outbreaks occur in those premises that have been vaccinated, essentially the conventional control measures will still apply. There will still be culling in most cases, but there's a little bit of flexibility around timing potentially. And then there's also, I guess, decisions to be taken around how vaccination is implemented if they're in restricted zones, so if infection has occurred in premises nearby. And so that's, they wouldn't be depopulating vaccinated flocks, and there's some, I guess, decisions over whether you continue vaccination or not in that situation. So just to summarise, so mandatory vaccination of ducks has started in France as of 2 days ago. That was a picture from yesterday. It's an initial one-year vaccination programme and then with ongoing monitoring, so it'll be very interesting to see how that progresses. There's a lot of information online about it if you're interested in more details. And I guess just interesting to see already from, I think, 2 days ago that the US has already put trade restrictions in place. So they've restricted importation of poultry from France and live ducks, duck eggs, and other duck products from Europe. So would be interested to see what other people who know more about international trade situations think about how that might play out going forwards. That's everything from me. Thank you. Apologies for the last-minute presentation, but I'm very aware that other people in here will be able to comment, and I hope they will do. But I hope that gives us at least a kind of a framework for understanding how things are going ahead in France, and hopefully that will lead nicely at least into Esteban's presentation. And as I pointed out, at least we can be read about the French if we know there's no one listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harriet. I think because the intention is that we have lots of discussion at the end, we won't take questions now, but if you can keep your questions for the end of the talks. So our next speaker is Esteban Simões, who's a vet who's worked in the UK with the Welsh Government and with APHA, and currently has a role in policy at the Scottish Government with a remit of endemic exotic diseases and international trade. So perhaps we can get some perspectives on what's going on between Europe and the US. So thank you, Esteban.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move this microphone slightly so I can read the lectern, my slides without trying to pick over the lectern. Right, so thanks very much, Harriet, by the way. That's a really good intro. And of course, back to a question we had at the end of the last talk is, of course, we look at what's happening elsewhere and learn lessons, particularly this something relatively quite topical and pretty close to us, and that engages a lot of the considerations that we in policy have to undertake. So before I even start, there's so many parts to this equation. That's what this presentation is about. There's so many different areas to cover in terms of getting the expert advice, looking at the science, looking at what the industry needs, what are the politics involved, what are the trade impacts, and so on. And us in policy trying to balance all that and choose the right measures. And I think, from my point of view, sitting inside a policy team and talking to largely people in academia and so on, I think that's kind of the message that I want to convey, and we can talk more about how we can help each other. So going on, so just very quick reminder, huge impacts of bird flu to the health and welfare. It's a pretty horrible disease and that kills very quickly, especially in certain species. There's well-being costs. I'm talking about well-being costs. Of course, there's all the financial stuff, but this is, imagine being a poultry keeper who's got his flock wiped out and his livelihood, or the the chickens or whatever he's bred, he's put his life's efforts into it. This is a horrible situation. And also to mention the people on the ground doing the job for us. They're doing overtime and going to these remote places, and it's always on a Friday. And you know, it's difficult. It's very difficult. It puts a lot of strain on a lot of moving parts in the whole mechanism. Of course, financial costs, the opportunity costs. You know, government could be doing something else other than just fighting a disease that's already here and be preventing disease. And of course, for the industry themselves, it directs a lot of attention to them. Trade restrictions, we'll mention that in a little bit more. Food security, of course, that's probably what's happening a little bit in France. They had so much AI that is disrupting supply chain. And actually, in the UK, the reason why some supermarkets are is there's not a supply problem, from what I understand. It's not what they've said. It's not a supply of eggs problem. There is preparation in case there would be some panic, because bird flu has been on the news. It's very topical, isn't it? COVID, bird flu, and in order to reduce panic buying, there's some restrictions on how much eggs you can buy at the moment, and potential public health risks. So that is a potential thing. Could be a game changer. Right now, the risk is very low. We're monitoring, we're looking, but ultimately we need to uphold. It's not just the reputation, but of course we need that reputation for all sorts of. But it means that we are looking after our animals and our people. So why do we vaccinate in the first place? So at flock or individual level, you want to protect the flock. That goes without saying. This is by resisting the infection. This could be by suppressing clinical signs, or by reducing shedding. So this is at an individual sort of flock level. At the more zonal, this is where we think more in policy side, is the emergency use that's been mentioned just now, the preventative use, or eradication. Now these depend really very much what's the situation. In countries like the UK, like Scotland, where we're generally free of a lot of these diseases, vaccination is often not a good idea because sorry, I'm just go back a bit. The stamping out policy has always been the most effective means of controlling an disease that otherwise does not exist here, just here temporarily. Just I need to get rid of it. So, but there are countries in the world who are having to fight AI, in which the disease is endemic. So they, and so the context. This is what's important to get out from here, is the context in which we are determines the approach to take. So just to explain a little more, emergency use, it's as it says, it's using vaccine in an emergency, which is a little bit difficult considering the time that you need to get immunity from a vaccine. Preventative use is what's being done in France, is to protect a sector well in advance, and eradication is when, of course, you have disease, you try to find it. But there's various reasons why we would want to use vaccination. So this is the kind of the pros, but like I said, the different objectives, we need to define our objective. It requires different vaccine requirements and different approaches. Right, so taking hypothetical use. In France, they're using it in ducks. Would we use it in ducks? Not sure. Could we use it in turkeys, for example, to protect the Christmas market, for example? Would we use it in outdoor waterfowl, high-risk areas? And you start thinking about the species of bird, what kind of vaccine you have, what is the disease situation in the area, how long does the immunity likely to take effect, and how long it lasts, how is it easy to administer. So there's a few scenarios that could just make us think, why would we protect some sectors Of course, human health risk, if suddenly it became a human health scare, it probably is more likely, it would be more likely that we would vaccinate. So, for example, commercial farms and protecting high-value genetic stock is some of the reasons why the French are doing it. On special category premises, we were talking about things like zoos and so on. It's not permitted in Scotland, but it is in England and Wales, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Gordon, and or Richard. But right, so we have diseases do not respect borders, so we have a GB control policy, and most certainly a disease that is falling from the sky, literally. So there's a GB strategy. We are it's a devolved policy area, but there's a high degree of consistency between different nations of Great Britain and indeed Northern Ireland, even though they're using they're having to abide by EU law. It's still very similar. Even we're very similar to the EU regs. Still at the moment, haven't diverged that much. So it's what I said earlier. Our main control measure is stamping out the disease. Now, there's a Scottish instrument that enables the use of emergency vaccination or preventative vaccination. It's never been used, but crucially legally requires a risk assessment. The minister cannot make the decision without a risk assessment, and this is where the science and expertise come into play. We need to commission the relevant risk assessments if there's a number of decisions to consider, not just yes or no, but when do we stop, and so on. And in terms also of governance, I think just to highlight that we consult as a government and work closely with other devolved governments and with the industry. There's a core work group with members of the poultry industry looking precisely at this question. So to explore options, develop recommendations, and it will report to what we call the Animal Disease Policy Group, where the heads of animal health policy across the UK meet together, and the 4 chief vets, and they take official level decisions on policy, if necessary, take to ministers. And that's where all the cooperation happens at a policy level, and that's where decisions are made, and that's where all the sources of evidence, all the expert advice, the data, the industry views come into play. So just to give you a flavor how we operate in our ivory tower. So I keep saying that, it's probably unfair to policy colleagues, which I'm on, but it's about really us understanding that we need to listen what's on the real world side. So apologies for the slide, I'm not sure if it's slightly, but it's just to point out, I said why vaccination can be used, and I'll explain now why it might not be such a silver bullet. So really the question is how limited the application is and what's the weighing the pros and cons, because it's definitely not a silver bullet. All the costs and resources, especially if we're vaccinating to cull, and we would vaccinate to cull anyway because we want to eradicate the disease, because the difficulty with vaccination, and even if you can tell apart an infected animal, an infected bird from a truly infected one, you still have to cull it because trading partners won't accept it. And my quick instinct reaction to that is that at the trade, I'll talk more separately about the trade side of things, but it's potentially a relatively quick reaction from the US in relation to France to banning the imports. I'm just thinking, what's my gut feeling is that perhaps I don't know if there was discussion through the right forums at the World Trade Organization, whether the US felt sufficiently informed, but it's very common at a trade point of view for countries to take measures that might be seen to other countries as excessive, but each country is just, that's what they're allowed to do, to determine their own level of protection. If they want to be very, very risk averse, they can be. We are risk averse. We are generally a nation with a high health status, high standards of assurance, our authorities and so on. So we don't want to bring disease in. So we put the barrier high generally. Moving on, there's massive strain already on our competent authorities on the ground. That would be the Animal and Plant Health Agency, the laboratory, and the field teams, and all the other partners involved in fighting the current outbreak, which has been unprecedented, as you are well known. And crucially, because of the trade implications, we have to do all the other surveillance that we require to detect disease, to prove freedom of control zones, and so on. Now, crucially, to trade with the EU, they've put the requirements for surveillance of vaccinated farms, is what was alluded to earlier by Harriet, which is very onerous. And this in itself, one of the major factors, so costly to survey and prove that vaccinated farms aren't infected on a monthly basis, that really you started to reduce your options. Who's going to do it? Because you need to have a value of a bird, and you need to have the interest of the industry. The vaccine itself needs to match the requirements. I'll talk about that in a minute. Might be taking a bit long, so please rush me if you need to. Yes, thank you. Okay, so it might delay reacquisition of freedom, because we're having to do all these other things. It's not just, even if the industry was doing it all themselves under our supervision, we still have to put a lot of resource into it, and we're not doing other things that might, so there's an opportunity cost there. The trade impacts, and I'll talk a little bit more about the trade. So it's both the EU Animal Health Regulation, because we trade a lot with the EU, and the World Animal Health Organization that sets standards for vaccination. And ultimately, if countries are arguing at WTO level, if they don't have a trade agreement, for example, or even if they do, it doesn't matter. But the WOHA sets some of those minimum standards. So if we have a vaccination, if we weren't to use vaccination, we kind of need to satisfy our trading partners and the institutions themselves. So we'd have to satisfy the EU, we'd have to satisfy our trading partners, and we need to submit a plan to WOHA, and there's governance around that, and it's not just what we think our vaccination plan is, it's what others think our vaccination plan is, and ultimately at trade level is about trust that we're doing what we're saying we're doing. And just to mention, it's probably the biggest risk of all probably is the disease becoming endemic if the approach actually failed. So we really want to try to go back to a freedom status, but we'll see how this works. And if we were in a situation where disease is endemic and we're vaccinating like the French, and that's one of the lessons I want to learn from France, is what does the public think about all those chickens that have been vaccinated, and scare stories around, these, what are these government people doing to the chickens and so on. So those things can come to play. Just to, again, another point, one of our largest trading partner is reviewing their surveillance requirements next year. So whatever we plan for now might actually be slightly different next year. So us in policy have to take into account a lot of these things. So we have to have an exit strategy. We need to know when will we stop and how will we stop. We need to have a plan for how we're going to demonstrate that we're free, that we've got no vaccine escape, for example. How do we demonstrate that our vaccinated flocks never got infected and we missed disease? And what other measures do we put into place? Probably we have to restrict them, or if we don't cull them, or what do we do really? So there's quite a lot that goes into an exit strategy. We say this a lot in government. When you start doing something, you need to know how to get out of it. So, which helps guide the planning for the future, and really makes people think, because also it's important to do something, and you need to know that it works. So that's why we would review that it did work and carry out any assessments, risk assessments that demonstrate that we can go back to normality once things are complete. So kind of summarize, before we even would make a decision on policy, we need to know why we're vaccinating. We need to decide what are we vaccinating and what vaccination requirements do we have. So for example, I mentioned endemic countries, they're not going to get eradication that soon. So probably at initial stage, in the first few years of a large vaccination campaign, they might not need the DIVA testing requirement, which means they might not need to differentiate. So, and for the specific sector, and I'll talk more about vaccine properties, the specific sector, we need to define what vaccine matches our expectations, and that can only be done also in consultation with the industry, because it depends on the sector that is interested in doing it. And again, drive from the industry is quite important. How much do we need? This is another key thing. So it's a commercial risk for these vaccine manufacturers to provide. They need certainty. They need to know that they're going to provide enough, or they might be having more lucrative contracts in other parts of the world. So they might have to fight for vaccines. So all these things come into play. And again, exit strategy, we cannot start something that we can't finish, just put it in a sort of different way, I guess. Then define what kind of zones, if we did zones, so how are we going to store it, and how are we going to distribute it, and crucially administer it, and so on. That's a big issue with vaccines, by the way. You have to inject them. There's no mass administration of vaccines for AI. So that adds to the cost and the time that is required. And crucially, who pays for it? And do we make it mandatory like the French did, or we just let the industry get on with it? So there's examples of vaccination through in animal health policy where different options were taken, and the uniqueness of this strain of AI, not just AI in general, this strain of AI will influence what decision is ever taken, if it is taken. Again, I mentioned about governance. We need to follow the right governance. And that is not just the process. It means that we've listened to all the interested parties. And of course, there's other things we consider. So requirements for a vaccine. So obviously, the first one, it needs to be effective. But the key question is, how much? Do we want to suppress 100% of infection from birth to birth, or do we want, is 80% good enough? So we need to take the advice from the scientists and the experts that tell us this sort of performance is going to deliver the policy objective, or help you deliver, because it does this or doesn't do that. And then you try it like the French did, I think, and see if it really works. How much coverage rate does it have? So it's kind of similar to what I was just saying. Do we need a DIVA? We would need a DIVA for sure. And administration route, like I said, we don't have group administration yet. It's under development, and that's a major barrier. The target species and range. Does it matter that we can't, that we want to do turkeys, but the vaccine isn't very good in turkeys? So all these things come into play. When does it start? And this is also a big one. So for example, a bird needs to live in its production life long enough for a vaccine to be efficient. So it's obviously pointless to do broilers because they don't live long enough, and there's so many, of course. So that goes out of the window straight away. But then you think, okay, well, layers, 18 months, 2 years, ducks a bit longer maybe, and then I'll just move on because I lost my train of thought right now. Sorry. I thought it was a good distraction, I guess. And obviously cost, it comes in, because ultimately who pays for this? And as mentioned about availability and distribution, and crucially, regulatory approval. If there's any veterinary medicines directorate colleagues in the room, there's the mention, you'll be nodding now. We've had some contact with the manufacturers, so I'll give a little overview of what we kind of know in terms of what's happening on the vaccine development. So there's various commercial players, as you'd imagine. There's various different technologies, which I'll not pretend that I understand too much about, but they have different properties and different ease of manufacture. We heard some promising stuff in terms of technology, I can say that. And lots of experience around the world in China, US, and Asia in general. I think there's an African country, no, I'm not sure. Maybe generally Asia. Various stereotypes, and there's even a broad spectrum one, which has apparently been used in Asia. So it looks like if you broaden the spectrum a little bit, you reduce your performance, but that might still be good enough, because at population level immunity, and again, that's the advice that we need from the experts, does say an 80% coverage rate help us? So of course the manufacturers report very good performance with their own trials. We do ours obviously because we need to see things working before committing a huge amount of resource and money. Immunity sort of duration, I mentioned this before, it's long to start off, so 3 to 4 weeks to start makes things a bit difficult. There's still a risk period. What if you vaccinate and you still get infected? So you've wasted the resources. And the need to do boosters, there's single dose ones, but it depends whether the single dose matches the strain and the speed, the target species we want to, and has the other performance. So lots of different things to think about. And importantly, this is all done with industry. So they're looking at the figures, setting up their requirements, and helping us understand what they need. They need to understand what we need in government, and that goes both ways. So again, it's back to that story I was talking about in the previous presentation, is cooperation. So I'm about to conclude. In summary, we need the good vaccine that is legal to use. We need to work quickly and lasting immunity, or we might not need it, all the times, because it is more essential maybe that is compatible with our surveillance testing. That's where DIVA comes in. But not just that, is the cost of doing all that surveillance testing. Can we optimize the whole process? Because then it becomes a big process of vaccinating, continuous surveillance, samples to the lab, and so on. Things like, how do you store these things come into play in terms of the overall cost. It is a massive amount of optimization in the process, I think, still to be done. Again, with the logistics and do we have enough people and the capability, so the skills to administer these things. The cost, I mentioned surveillance, is very heavy. Our partners, trading partners, be assured. So we probably need to be, if we are considering vaccinating, say, next year, we will be talking to the US now, just say, oh, we're planning to vaccinate, so what do you think? What's your worries about this? We don't want to disrupt trade, and all that needs to happen. And of course, communicating very clearly with our stakeholders. I mentioned understanding the specific needs of industry, specific needs of the governments, or which need to uphold our international obligations and actually follow our own legislation. We need legislation to do anything different than what is allowed now. So is there political appetite to do legislation, that sort of thing? So definitely not a substitute for biosecurity, and wink to France there. I mean, I'm being cheeky, but ducks, non-indicator species, they like water, and it's hard to keep a duck clean, I suppose. But we need a clear rationale for policy intervention, and that's why this is a very complex decision with very likely limited application in the context of this island, I guess, and that's mostly because the cost of administration and the surveillance for the vaccine. That's it. I don't know why you show the full slide and now he's animating it. That's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll do the questions at the end. Our next speaker this afternoon is Dan Hayne from the University of Glasgow. Dan's known to many of us in EPIC as a friend and colleague and collaborator, and is going to give us a personal perspective on the potential for vaccination in wild birds. Dan, take it away. There's a
thing.
A thing, yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Louise. Sorry for your troubles. I think I've been asked to talk about this because I was asked to chair the working group of Nature Scott that was asked to consider avian influenza in wild birds. And I was only asked to do that because I'm on the scientific advisory committee of Nature Scott, and they need to have these committees chaired by someone from there, so I don't have any enormous expertise in wild birds or avian influenza, but I am a sort of infectious disease ecologist. Actually, we were told specifically not to think about vaccination of wild birds by Nature Scott, so it was totally out with what we were asked to think about. So what I have to say today is entirely removed from that and separate and cooked up in the last couple of weeks since I got the invitation. And my insights are fairly limited, I'm afraid. I mean, probably we could all come up with roughly what I'm going to say. I'm going to basically follow my instructions, but because the situation is so serious in wild birds, and because there is so few options on the table about what we can actually do about it, I'm going to deviate briefly at one point and talk about carcass removal, because I think it's important. But starting off with vaccination, so I think as Esteban and other speakers have already kind of mentioned, we need to be very clear on what we're actually trying to achieve, and it could be a number of things. I mean, often vaccination is assumed to, the assumed role of vaccination is often to prevent outbreaks. As we all know, that would take a significant coverage, which is unlikely and difficult to achieve under any circumstances, almost anywhere, with anything. So there are other objectives which are perfectly reasonable. I mean, in conservation, we often think about a minimum viable breeding population that could be protected against infectious diseases. You could just sort of preserve more birds. I mean, that's not a bad idea. And of course, we might be worried about zoonotic potential and viral replication, and just having less viral replication, and so that zoonotic potential is relieved. And these are all potential objectives. I suspect that sort of preserve more birds is probably what a lot of people have in mind. So there's on the assumption that we're thinking about sort of vaccines in their current form, which is a big if, and interested to hear what's in the pipeline, which I wasn't really aware of. But assuming that their vaccines are as they are roughly now, obviously we have a challenge with coverage, with duration of immunity against roughly homologous strains, and then immunity against new circulating strains. And these are all problematic areas for any vaccination program, let alone something in wild birds. So thinking about coverage. So I sort of wrote these remarks mostly thinking about seabirds, but I think it sort of probably generalizes. Individuals from most species can only really be feasibly vaccinated as chicks. And seabirds are pretty long-lived. So this means that the chicks represent a very small proportion of the overall population. I mean, like less than 5% probably. So any one age cohort that you get your mitts on will be less than 5% of the overall population. And so you say, well, what sort of coverage of a chick cohort is achievable? So I sort of thought, well, there's a lot of people who are very keen on ringing chicks. So you think, well, why don't we think, how many chicks have we succeeded in ringing? And that would give us a kind of a very broad idea of how much effort is required to vaccinate what proportion of the population. So here is some data that I learnt by eyeballing the BTO ringing database. So these are just example figures. I think we ring about, on a good year, I gather, we ring about 2,000 gannet chicks out of 200,000 possible chicks. So this is based on the number of chicks that each adult has and estimates of the gannet population size. So if you're lucky, you get 1% of gannet chicks, which remember are less than 5% of the overall gannet population. And you can see the rest of the figures for yourself. Things get a bit better when we think about sort of bonksies, for example, about which we're very concerned with the effects of avian influenza. There it could be as high as 20%. But I don't think there's any species where we're ringing more than 40% of chicks. And remember, again, those chicks are only 5% of the overall population. So, a totally positive, optimistic scenario would be, given a 20-year lifespan and a type 1 survival curve where everyone lives for 20 years and then falls off the cliff, so to speak, we might be able to vaccinate maybe 2% of the population a year. That would give you 40% coverage after 20 years, which is going to preserve some birds, but it's not going to do much else. And that's assuming all kinds of other things, which I'll come on to shortly. However, in certain locations, you might be able, there might be specific locations and specific circumstances in which you can do better. I mean, for example, I gather that albatrosses can be vaccinated at quite high rates against avian cholera on small islands in the South Atlantic because you can walk up and pick up an albatross on the nest. But these are special and unusual cases. So obviously, on top of all this, we want to worry about the immunity provided, and again, what would vaccination prevent? Infection, disease, transmission. We could go for transmission. And as I understand it, and I've only had a relatively superficial look at the literature, but immunity to homologous challenge is quite short term. Often seems to be measured in months rather than years. So we don't actually have a vaccine that seems to me would protect a seabird for more than a few months, and that's your one-time shot at getting it in. And then, of course, even if you did have a vaccine that, say, had current antigenic kind of scope, we'd have to worry about changes in the circulation of antigenically related viruses. And I know Sam managed to convince me that maybe antigenically related strains kicked around for 5 to 10 years. So after that, all bets are off, and it could be quite a bit quicker than that. So not particularly encouraging. There are further considerations. I mean, people tend to ring the easy chicks, right? not the ones kind of 2/3 the way down the cliff face. So they're going to get harder and harder to get as you try to sort of put in extra effort. It's a skilled and hazardous work. So if you do want to upscale the vaccination levels that so to speak the ringers are achieving, you're going to have to train a lot more people in this line of work. Some species of bird react very poorly, I gather, to being handled, and some species are quite tolerant of it, and some are very, very sensitive to it. And remember, you're mucking around with birds' nests and their fecundity and recruitment, and it could turn out to be quite a counterproductive exercise if you weren't a bit careful. And again, not an expert in this area, but I gather that you want to ring a chick midway through its fledgling process. I guess so that it's reasonably big but not too big. I'm not quite sure why ringers go for this sort of mid-range. But even if I suppose we would have to be concerned about the role of maternal antibody in vaccinating chicks. So even if there was immunity circulating in the population, would the one time we can get our mitts on these individuals to put vaccine in them be the one time that actually that would be tricky because of the presence of maternal antibody? I don't really know, but it's definitely something to think about. So I can see why Nature Scott asked us to maybe not think about this, because it seems to me deeply challenging, and which is not to say that there might be particular colonies of particular value where potentially a bit more, some much more limited objective might be achieved, but it seems to me that with current vaccines and current reach of these vaccines, that seems pretty much off the table to me. Of course, if the nature of the vaccine changes, if for some reason you can come up with an aerosolized vaccine or a baited vaccine or something like this, then obviously the sums change a bit. So that's actually all I really have to say on the subject of vaccinating wild birds. I'll just mention this because I know that it's something EPIC's, Katie Adam obviously worked on this with EPIC, and it's something that we thought about in the working group. And it sort of made me, I thought it was an interesting thing to think about. It's a slightly unusual kind of problem. So this chart, ever since I became an epidemiologist sometime in the 90s, this graph's always interested me. It shows the relationship between R0 and the proportion of a population that is infected in a closed, simple SIR process. And it's sort of good news and bad news. What it shows is this very, very steep relationship between R0 and the proportion infected. So that by the time R0's even 2, in a simple well-mixed model, you're talking about 80% of a population getting infected in a simple epidemic. And so if R0 is 6, and you manage to achieve a whacking 50% cut in that, you don't get very far. You reduce the total number of infected from about 99.99% to about 99.91% or something. But if R0 is 2.2 and you halve it to 1.1, you make an enormous improvement. So the effects of reducing effectively R0 depends very much on what R0 is. And so sort of, and I think when we think about carcass removal, I had this in mind. So I was thinking, what effect is it? Could I plausibly speculate this might have? And of course, we're used to thinking about R0 in terms of the number of infected individuals in a fully susceptible population over the infectious lifetime of an individual. But of course, we're talking about dead time as well now. So we have if you think about the total R0 of a wild bird, we've got the green bit where the bird's alive and spreading infection, and then we have the gray bit where it's dead and spreading infection. And then we've got the bit, or the white bit there, which is the bit that you might save by removing carcasses. So of course we don't know the length of any of these bars, but if we go for a sort of 60-40 split between green and gray, I think that's probably being reasonably generous to the dead part, perhaps. I don't really know. And given that we're not going to pick up a lot of carcasses that do exist, we won't find them, and we certainly won't find them straight away. The white bit might be half the grey bit. I don't really know, but we could sort of play these games, right, with these numbers. And so you can then say, well, what would I achieve under different scenarios with different values of R0, ranging here from 1.5 to 6, different proportions of carcasses removed, ranging from 0 to 1 on the x-axis, and then the white bit being 0.2 of the grey bit, 0.4 of the grey bit, 0.6 of the grey bit, 0.8 of the grey bit. And one could sort of go anywhere you want on these sensitivity analyses, but if you look at the top right there, so there, the blue circle is sort of a potentially plausible place for influenza, R naught of about sort of 2 or 3. The white, the bit of R naught from the dead part that you're saving by removing the carcasses, 40% of 40%, and perhaps we're getting perhaps the sort of intermediate value for the carcass removal component, and you can't see the colours on the contours probably, but that blue circle is giving you a 5 to 10% impact on total number of infected cases in a colony, say. So I think that's a fairly limited impact, and it's quite a lot of work for a relatively modest saving of 5 to 10% of birds that would otherwise have been infected. Now, of course, you can be more optimistic, and I think there might be, I think whereabouts you are on these graphs, I think might be quite dependent on what kind of birds you're talking about and what colonies. And I think I gather terns are a favourite for this for various reasons. So we sort of were. And people are obviously very interested in carcass removal because it is pretty much the only thing the only option that we really have. But we wanted to limit expectations. But we definitely think that, given that it is the only option, that it's sensible to do a sort of learning by doing kind of exercise, and we should be doing structured kind of natural kind of investigations into the effectiveness of this, and that is exactly what. A paper by Neef et al., which is sitting on bioRxiv, I think hasn't actually out yet in the peer-reviewed literature, but it is accessible. And this is some data from terns around the edge of the North Sea, all around the North Sea, and so they had colonies in which they removed carcasses, which are in blue, and colonies where they did not remove carcasses, which are in red. And they adjusted for the time of the first case because that has a big impact on sort of the severity of the outbreak, the size of the outbreak. And so we have the survival probability on the y-axis, and you can see that the blue line where they've been removing carcasses floats above the red line where they did not remove carcasses by an amount that varies between sort of 30% on the far left and about 5-10% on the right. And the authors claim this is a statistically significant result. And I think it's a great study. I mean, it's exactly what I think we should be doing. I would have some quibbles with the actual analysis here. I mean, if those two outliers, if we drop either point A or point B, you lose the result. And the analysis they've conducted accounts for some autocorrelation, some spatial correlation between the different colonies. And interestingly, if you don't account for that, the result is not significant, and if you do account for it, it is, which slightly puzzles me as a sort of. Normally, when you have this kind of dependency between points, you have slightly less information than you think, and not more. And I haven't actually met anyone who's been able to really persuade me that how this is possible. But it's what happens when you use some of these very modern sort of Inler-based methods for adjusting for covariant structure. But it makes me a bit concerned. It shouldn't really be that way around. But anyway, I mean, there's enough there to generate some interest, and so this remains, I think, something of an open question. So that's it. I've talked to Amandine Gamble, who nearly came to talk instead of me, Bob Furness and Sam, who's given me various other perspectives on this, and that's it. Thanks very much.
Dan?
There's a couple of spare slides in the back.
Oh, right, okay. We're going to wrap up the talks with just a very quick-fire overview of the work that EPIC has been doing in the area of avian influenza. We haven't yet begun to work on vaccination, but we just thought we'd have a few slides so you can see what we've been doing thus far as the sort of context for any future work that we might begin to do on vaccination. And I think we kick off with Thea. This will be quick fire, so you guys probably want to stand up already. And it seemed you ought to get to your next slide, Stan. There we go. Wasn't pressing hard enough.
Yeah, I think there's a couple.
Yeah, there we go.
Thanks. Thank you. I know very little about vaccination, and I've just got a very basic model for avian influenza. So I was thinking about how to incorporate the effects of vaccination into this model to maybe study the outcomes. But this work has progressed since the start of the session, just in my thinking. So here you see a model I've presented at previous occasions as well, where at each premises you've got some susceptible poultry, which can, through infection, move to the exposed category, then onto the infectious category, where they contaminate their environment, their immediate environment, with virus being shed, and that also adds infectious pressure again to the susceptibles. And then after some time, these infectious animals get removed either through, mostly not recovery. It's by culling. They're removed from the flock. Now, at each premises, in terms of this model, we can maybe have another category called the vaccinated category, but I've realized now that I need a couple of more arrows there, because of course you can vaccinate the susceptible animals in a preventative way, but that immunity wanes over time, so there should be an arrow again going back to the susceptible. And then also, of course, even vaccinated animals, I think, can sometimes be exposed and then get infected. So there's some other considerations as well in this model. Maybe if the vaccinated animals become infectious, they'll just shed less virus in their environment. But the main idea is that at each premises, you take out some of the susceptible population that adds to the infectious pressure. You take them out of basically the circulation process. And then between premises, we've worked at the spread between premises based on distances, and maybe for new incursions of the virus, say along a wild bird flyway, we can say that maybe infection spreads over the landscape quicker in one direction. So for example here, the red direction distance from A to B, it might spread through the environment and wild bird contact quicker than in the opposite direction from B back to A. As I've just heard now in Dan's talk, maybe we shouldn't think about vaccinating wild bird populations. So I don't think this is a feasible option to do any have different values for the parameters here. Probably we need to focus on the within premises level. But so that's my 2 slides now. Sibylle next.
Hello, I'm Sibylle Moore, and I will give you, so this is also not about vaccination, this is about the interactive dashboard that we have developed in EPIC to support information sharing within EPIC, but also to support decision making and to increase or kind of facilitate communication with policymakers. So unfortunately this is a dry run, but for anyone who's interested, I can give you a live demonstration on the laptop. So okay, so what you can see on the top is that the dashboard for now has 3 tabs. We are looking at the first tab, which maps the outbreaks in time, space, and across species. So we are mapping poultry and captive birds, as well as avian and non-avian wildlife, mammals. And to the left you have some filters. You can filter down the data on county level, country level. You can select the species you want to look at, and you can also limit it to a certain time window. On the bottom, you see a data table which contains either the full data set or the filtered down data set, and it will give you also information on the bottom how many cases there were in either the whole data set or the filtered down data set. There's also the option to download the data as CSV file or Excel file, and then you can do further analyses with it. And we have also now added in a kind of overlaid a map of modeled poultry farm densities, and you can switch that on or off in the absence of having the actual data for now. But this might be something that we can adjust, and we can enrich the data that we display. Also, if you click on markers, it will give you certain information, what kind of species have been infected, when, where, and so on. You can also visually select subsets. You can measure distances between points. So when we move on now to the second tab, which shows you, well, I should also say the first map showed you the 2022 to 2023 season, and on the kind of epidemic curves tab, we have the two last seasons added in together, and on the top you can see the findings in wild birds over time, grouped by week as well as bird family. These plots are also interactive. You can zoom in and look at what kind of species had been infected. You can click on it, isolate species. On the bottom you see the epidemic curve for the last two seasons, grouped again by week as well as by country. And yes, there are also options to download these plots and so on. And I should also say that we are working on integrating SAM's sequence data, so we had a little bit of a chat, and hopefully that can be done within the next few weeks. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to show you the dashboard, and if you have any suggestions what we should add in, please let me know. That's me.
Sibylla's mapping work has been used in part to support some of the risk assessment work that's being conducted by Katie Adam that Dan referred to, in particular what the benefits might be from carcass collection, and Katie has been conducting risk assessments to ask what the impact of carcass collection might be on transmission to wild mammals, to other wild birds, and also to domestic poultry. Now, I've been sort of briefed to say that the sort of the results up there have to be caveated with there's an extraordinary uncertainty. There's very, very large uncertainty because of the difficulty in sort of nailing down the appropriate information to really work out how valuable carcass collection will be. So it sort of ties in with what Dan was saying. I guess something to observe up there is that certainly their assessment seemed to be that there would be greater benefits in areas of lower densities of seabirds, perhaps because underlying that is an assumption of lower transmission rates, lower R0 in those settings. And the other sort of main point that I think Katie wanted to make was that carcass collection is extremely logistically challenging, and if we were trying to sort of do vaccination as well, again, that would incur many of the same challenges involving health and safety and abseiling up and down cliffs and all sorts of extraordinary things. So I think, again, this, Katie's slides tie in very well with what Dan gave us in the last talk. And now to continue the seabird theme, I will hand over for Giles, who's speaking on behalf of somebody else who couldn't make it to the conference.
Yes, Dave Ewing, who did this work, is on parental leave at the moment, so I'm giving his talk. So he has some data from an island where there a colony of terns. It's in Germany. The colony is about 2,000 birds, and they daily check all of the nests and have collected the dead birds. So he has the data on the dead birds. And that's the curve at the bottom there. And what he noticed was that actually the curve is effectively the same as the first parts of the curves at the top there, which are small early outbreaks of African swine fever. And so he said, well, can I use the same model that I've used for African swine fever for avian influenza in this group of terns? So the model, I don't want to bother with all the Greek, it's all Greek to me. But the important thing is it's a susceptible, exposed, infectious, and then they can either be removed, i.e. they die, or they're recovered. And the ones that die, a proportion of them are detected and a proportion of them will just be missed, because it's assumed that some of these will actually die while they're out at sea. So he didn't assume that he had all the deaths, he just assumed there was a constant proportion of deaths. And it's really quite interesting what he found. R0 is sort of around about 3, maybe 4, something like that. Relatively high. The next curve, so I'm going across the middle line there, R0, and the next curve is the degree of infections that came from the environment rather than from direct bird-to-bird contact. And this model predicts that actually that's very low. In this group, nearly all the infections were by direct bird-to-bird contact. And then if we look at the bottom row there, the proportion that dies actually quite low. In this group of terns, in this outbreak, it was actually quite low. Only around about 28% were dying following infection, although there is some uncertainty about that, but we're pretty certain it's still quite low. And you might say, well, okay, he just missed a lot. But then when he looks, the prediction for the proportion of the mortalities that he missed is incredibly low. You know, it's about 2%. So they are actually finding most of the dead birds. The model predicts that. So obviously what this model is fitted. For those of you who are interested, it's a reversible jump Bayesian MCMC approach that he used to fit it, and a bespoke method of fitting that he devised himself to get precise answers. But the fit to the data suggests that they're actually not missing very many. Oh, I thought there was another slide. Maybe it was on there. Oh, it's on the next steps. It was there. I missed it. So at the moment, he doesn't sort of have an environmental reservoir as such with decay or anything like that, with, you know, birds pooing in the environment and then it decaying off. And he thinks that may be an important factor, and that might actually alter this balance between R0 and environmental transmission. The other thing that he has, so he knows exactly where these birds' nests were and where the bodies were found, which are basically on the nests. And the nests are clustered on, he's got the data for the whole island, but the nests are clustered on the island. They're not evenly spread over the island. And obviously that may affect the spread, because it may be more spread within a cluster than between clusters. But at the moment, he just assumes, which is not totally unreasonable in wild seabirds who are probably foraging together and interacting quite a lot, he assumes that there's sort of thorough mixing of the whole colony. Okay. Thank you.